Next week marks 10 years since the US-led invasion of Iraq, and in a moment we're going to be talking about the war and how it changed America and its place in the world. But first, here's something to jog your memory.
The drumbeat for war in Iraq began publicly in the United States soon after the September 11th attacks in 2001.
The United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
The Taliban was ousted from power in Afghanistan, but the 9/11 mastermind Osama bin Laden was still in hiding. Meanwhile, the Bush administration's focus shifted to the possible threat from Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein. Did he still have a chemical weapons program? Was he trying to build an atomic bomb?
We don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud.
Colin Powell was President Bush's trump card. A soldier who opposed war except as a last resort was now saying the case against Saddam's weapons program was solid.
Leaving Saddam Hussein in possession of weapons of mass destruction for a few more months or years is not an option. Not in a post-September 11th world.
With UN weapons inspections thwarted and allies Australia, Britain and Poland by their side, 10 years ago in March 2003, America went to war in Iraq. Operation Iraqi Freedom went almost perfectly to plan. Within 21 days, the major combat mission was complete. No weapons of mass destruction were found, but Saddam Hussein was forced from power and on the run.
The United States and our allies have prevailed.
Back in Iraq, the bloodshed was just beginning. With the dictator gone, old scores were being settled. Sectarian violence erupted and chaos filled the power vacuum. Saddam Hussein was found in hiding in an underground spider hole in late 2003 and executed 3 years later. In 8 years of fighting, more than 3,500 American troops would be killed in Iraq, surpassing the death toll of 9/11. 2 Australians died. The exact Iraqi death toll is still unknown. Estimates range anywhere from 150,000 to over 600,000 people killed. And while the US-led combat forces are now gone, the violence in Iraq continues. Joining us now at the roundish table, the editor of The Spectator Australia and a research associate at the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, Tom Switzer. Tom, welcome.
John, good to be here. Chaz.
Thanks. Now, Tom, if John Bolton was a panellist here, and who knows, depending on the managing director of the ABC, one day he might be, he would ask you, Tom, would you prefer if Saddam Hussein was still in power today than what happened over the last 10 years?
Well, I have a great deal of respect for John. I worked with John at the American Enterprise Institute in the mid to late 1990s, so I know his arguments back to front. Look, obviously, one has to concede Saddam Hussein was a murderous tyrant who defied a lot of the United Nations resolutions. And I think one of the problems that many of the critics of the war made during the lead-up to the war was that they'd often sugarcoat his crimes. Michael Moore in particular, I thought was quite offensive. But to answer your question, I would probably prefer Saddam Hussein to be in power, all things considered, because the threat that he posed to America and to the coalition clearly could have been contained and deterred the way it had been since the previous Gulf War of 1991. The naval blockade, the sanctions regime, the no-fly zone, these policies were not perfect, but it did keep him in his box, and he was ultimately a rational calculator. He was not in cahoots with bin Laden or Al-Qaeda, and of course, as we now know, he didn't even have the weapons of mass destruction that justified the war.
And was containment the only other option, or was there another way of deposing him which didn't involve invading Iraq?
Well, look, the Clinton administration, believe it or not, in 1998 signed a declaration for regime change. So this view was bipartisan in Washington among Republicans and Democrats that Saddam Hussein should go. But look, in foreign policy, there's no perfect outcomes. It was messy, it was unpleasant, particularly for the people of the Shia people in the south of the regime. But ultimately, although containment and deterrence lacked the political sex appeal of liberation, I think it's fair to say it avoided the unintended consequences consequences that a liberated Iraq has delivered.
The architect's not just John Bolton, Doug Feith, somebody else that you know that we've had on this program as well. Where did they get it wrong? Is it, as the left has said from the outset, that Cheney, Rumsfeld, they're all itching to go to war in Iraq, 9/11 presented an opportunity that they were just waiting for? Or was it just a misreading of the situation, a belief that this would be, like Afghanistan had been in that early phase, a very quick surgical strike, it would force a regime change and we'd be out of there in a month?
Look, I don't think one should downplay the psychological impact that 9/11 had on the United States, both the common man and the elite. I think it was American outrage over September 11, combined with American global hegemony 10 years after the end of the Cold War and the collapse of communism, and of course American exceptionalism, which is very much part and parcel of the American psyche. I think together this combined in Washington the sense that America should ditch this twin strategy of deterrence and containment that had worked so well for the United States since the onset of the Cold War, replace those principles with one of prevention, exporting democracy, regime change, drain the swamp, so to speak, so that you can completely fix the area so that you don't whet the appetite of Islamists, and of course aggressive American unilateralism instead of coalition building, because the United Nations was bogged down in paralysis, not just because of Jacques Chirac and the French, but also the Chinese and the Russians. So this was a doctrine that came very much part of it became the central legitimating idea of Washington policy making. Democrats shared this view as well as Republicans. One should remember that Hillary Clinton, John Edwards, John Kerry, among other distinguished Democrats, also supported this doctrine. But clearly, after a year in Iraq in 2004, it was evident that the policy was dangerous, and it was leading to all sorts of unintended consequences.
You've been very generous there, Tom, with the people who advocate for Iraq, given that you have been proven to be correct. I think let's just call it straight out, you were right. Now, the people who are wrong, there hasn't been a lot of accountability for them. As you mentioned, John Kerry, the current Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, possibly the next president. The entire Republican foreign policy are still the same guys. They were helping Mitt Romney. William Kristol is still the kingmaker, whatever he is. They're all the same guys, all still in power. Every columnist who supported Iraq is still a columnist. There's been no accountability. Why has there been no accountability for people who are wrong? And should there have been accountability?
Well, I think, first of all, a lot of these people are creatures of their culture, and the American people, remember, unashamedly supported a lot of what their leaders were doing. So this was the psychological impact of 9/11. But I do think there has been some accountability in the sense that my friend John Bolton, for example, who was a senior policymaker in the State Department, he then went to work briefly as the US ambassador in the UN. John, I think, is damaged goods in Washington. He will struggle to get confirmed even under a Republican administration, because the Democrats would more than likely filibuster him. And even in the Republican Party, I think there are very deep divisions taking place right now between the neoconservative, hawkish, expansionist, pro-democracy wing of the party, and you see this in people like John McCain and Lindsey Graham in the Senate, versus more limited realist types like Senator Rand Paul. So I think that over time the Republican Party itself is starting to change. It wasn't evident, of course, in those controversial hearings against Chuck Hagel for the defence nomination, but nevertheless I do think that Republicans, the neoconservative wing of the party, are on the back foot.
You mentioned Rand Paul there, son of Ron Paul, who has been a sort of this interesting hybrid mix of libertarian but sort of being anti-war, and there's a sense that they maybe represent 15% of the Republican Party, but they're not yet mainstream and may never become it. Do you see that new isolationism actually taking firmer root in the Republican Party as they go through this process of working out who and what they are?
Well, the isolation was very much part and parcel of the Republican Party before World War II. And indeed there are remnants of that tradition in the Republican Party. You saw it in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of communism with someone like Pat Buchanan, who ran on an isolationist, protectionist ticket several times for the Republican nomination. And you're quite right, they were beaten quite convincingly. I think there's a missing middle here in the Republican Party. It's called the realist tradition. This is the realist tradition of President Bush Sr., advised by people like Jim Baker, Lawrence Eagleburger, Colin Powell, Richard Haas, James Baker. These were people who believe in containment and deterrence, and in many respects, I think that President Obama, although he expresses himself in a different way, I think he very much sees himself as more the embodiment of Bush 41, not Bush 43 or even Clinton. A realist. That is someone who recognises the costs and the limits of the use of force. And you see this right now in the rhetoric. On the campaign trail last year, President Obama went out of his way to say that true nation building begins at home. Even Mitt Romney, the Republican candidate, although he talked a tough line in the primaries about a Pax Americana and an American century, when push turned to shove, when he faced the voters in his keynote address, he only dedicated a paragraph to foreign policy, and he didn't even mention the Afghanistan war. In that debate between President Obama and Mitt Romney, President Obama mentioned the word peace 12 times. I think Mitt Romney said something like that as well. And Mitt Romney even said, we can't kill ourselves out of this mess. Now, this sounded like one of those catch cries out of Woodstock in the late 1960s.
Yeah. How do you square that, though, with, say, the Libya situation, which you know, is a little bit Iraq-esque, going in, removing Gaddafi? Like, have we really learnt that much? I mean, Mitt Romney mentioned Mali in the debate, which could be as a direct result of America going in
But Libya was a classic case where the Americans made it quite clear they did not want to do the heavy lifting. One of Obama's senior advisors gave an interview to the New Yorker magazine in April of 2011, around the time of the Libyan operation, saying that the new doctrine of the United States was to lead from behind. And what he meant by that was America can no longer impose its will, influence and leadership across the globe. It has to recognise limits.
Except through NATO and the occasional remote-controlled drone.
Absolutely. That's right.
Tom Switzer, always great to see you.
Thanks so much, John.
Thank you very much
Chat.
for joining us. Tom Switzer from the United States Studies Centre and The Spectator. That's all for Planet America for this week.